John Swinney's programme for government was able to re-announce that the winter fuel payments that were cut by Westminster will be restored in Scotland in September, that the two-child benefit cap that will not be tackled in Westminster will be removed in Scotland in April, and that peak rail fares will be scrapped for good. Is that enough to win over sceptical voters beginning to feel that they're going reform's way? Because they'll be in Scotland the same as they have been south of the border. And can Keir Starmer continue to tough out his line on these benefit cuts, with more to come, with the Welsh First Minister, the Labour Welsh First Minister, standing up to London to say disability cuts in Wales will have something like 6 times the impact that they will have in England? Can he continue to just say it's steady as she goes? We look at the international situation, which is astonishing, with incredible wins for Liberal forces in Australia and Canada. Not such good news in Romania. What's going on in Israel, and can anybody now stop that country from permanently occupying Gaza and herding its residents wherever they see fit? Those are the headlines. Now for the podcast.
Hi chums, and welcome to this week's Lesley Riddick podcast. And Lesley's hot foot from one Zoom meeting into another Zoom meeting. And we spent a good hour, I think, before that, not in the sunshine, but watching John Swinney produce, the statement on the Scottish programme for government. I'll get that out. Yeah, get my new teeth in. The Scottish government's programme for government for the next year, which has been advanced because, he wants to have a whole year to get all these things in place. Nothing at all to do with the Holyrood elections coming up next year. So, big headline, scrapping of the rail fares. But there was
the peak rail fares scrapped for good, as he put it.
Yeah.
You'd have to say, not exactly joy unabated.
No.
It's an odd one, that, and actually, because this is always the downside of speaking so soon after something, because there'll be people who write about this and go, "Oh, this is what it means." That's why he's done it. But I mean, all the reasons that it was a bit difficult last time was it not last time? And I wish I'd had a look at this now because it's coming back to me. Excuse me. Was it not an issue that there was actually some strike action on at the same time, so that the trains were shorter?
Oh.
And there was a thing of actually trains not even stopping at some stations during this period. And it looked like it was the worst time to have tried. I can remember writing a column which was, for me, and okay, I appreciate I'm probably not your average user in any way at all, but if you have to take your car to get to a train station because you live in the middle of nowhere, if there's nowhere to put the car at the station, you won't use the train. And it wouldn't matter if the fares were zero. It's just, you just can't do it. Now, I don't know, it might be unusual that way. Lots of people might be able to, are urban, and they might be able to take buses, trams, everything in cities. And perhaps that's a small beer thing for the rest of us that live in kind of rural Scotland. But it seemed to me there were just some difficulties of how you'd need to join stuff up to be able to make this really fly as a kind of proposal. But certainly when they took the peak rail fares, when they came back again, there was quite an outcry about it from people. So I guess that looks like the line that kind of struck me in everything he was saying was, in Scotland, this is what you get.
Yes.
That's better than the rest of the UK. So he was going over the old hits,
Yes.
If he was a band, he was basically playing that first, breakthrough LP. So he was going through everything. Fair enough, because there's still real gains that people have, whether it's the free prescriptions or, the Scottish Child payment that gets lent on extremely heavily. And, he's saying, I think he said taxes wouldn't rise any further, but we still have, higher taxes on higher income earners. And then I wonder as well, because the big push, he was talking about the NHS, and this was the most important thing. And there was numbers that were hard to keep track of, and probably the average person is going, 110,000
Yeah.
extra. That's now you see, if it had only been 50,000, I would have been a bit pissed off. But now you're telling me it's 110,000. Insert the nouns. I didn't catch what it was. It's probably just a general feel. There's a feeling thing about it. How do people notice when the NHS has got better? I mean, it's so very specific to you. If somebody is with a seriously crap practice GP
Yep.
wise, then you could hear that there's a million extra kind of appointments, but the fact that you can never get an appointment, you're stuck with a practice that will never make you believe that the Scottish government's doing anything useful. I guess that same problem applies in England, where it looks like there has been some success. Your best friend in the world was on this morning. That'll be Wes Streeting for the
Yes.
uninformed.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was talking about the only reason they'd been able to, and they do look like they have managed to reduce the waiting lists in England. And they said the only reason they'd done that is because of dosh they got from the national insurance rise.
Hmm.
Uh, I don't know if people go, oh, well, in that case, it's okay. It's almost like people have framed up their thinking, and these marginal improvement stuff, does that change dramatically how they look at the situation?
Hmm. I mean, I also thought when going back to the greatest hits there, that it was like he was playing a festival. What he was doing was laying the ground for what he knew the attacks that were going to come, in particular from Russell Finlay and Anna Sarwar. I mean, he knew the line of attack on the NHS. He knew, and he had his numbers at his fingertips. And I mean, what he did also say began with as well with things that weren't going to happen, which I think was also laying the ground. I mean, because for 2026, because he said that there was insufficient time, which is a very nifty way of with one bound he was free. I think was there insufficient time in the next for a misogyny bill because there were issues with the way it had been drafted by Helena Kennedy, which did include trans women in misogyny and the conversion theory. Now, he did say that they were going to be adding sex to the protected status in current legislation. And in conversion therapy, they were wanting to very smartly work across the UK. And if not, by the start of the next parliament, they would work with LGBTQI plus to actually work out a pathway to bring in legislation. So he got that one out of the way pretty dash quickly. The other thing he was trying to emphasize, Leslie, was the fact he was the all these things that we're doing were because of the budget, where four parties had worked across the chamber together to come together in a consensus on things on which they agreed. And it was honest John there talking the way he did about let's bring everybody together. And that lasted until the end of his speech when Russell Finlay put the boot in.
Yeah.
But yeah,
But I thought the thing however, that was interesting was, I mean, if you're looking at a lot of the kind of headlines in the chat today, is still in this post, everyone reeling from the
mm,
incredible, and I'm not meaning that in a positive way, but literally incredible results in the local elections that had reform right out there. And the effect that's having on Labour and the Tories.
yeah,
Now, lots of people are beginning to get bolder and bolder about saying, quite openly that it was the winter fuel
yeah,
payment what done it. And it's running in headlines, lots of speculation that they're being urged to just drop it, as a policy, not to just even ameliorate the thresholds, yada yada, but to actually get straight in there and drop that policy completely. Now, if that's where the pressure is on for Labour in England, which is, and in fact, while we're at it, you may have noticed that that the Welsh
oh
First
yes,
Minister, Eluned Morgan, who's Labour, was basically out today, and she was on the World at One, being presented as here's the feisty kind of alternative Labour view, basically saying that she had serious concerns about the cuts coming to disability because, as she was pointing out, in some coal-fare communities, 40% of working age adults receive disability benefits. And she said disability cuts will hit Wales 6 times more proportionally than England.
yeah.
Now, that's with a Labour government on a Labour government. So she's realising, waking up, smelling the coffee, as we heard from Richard Wynne Jones a long time ago, what a insightful interview that
Yeah.
one was, that, the Welsh Labour are quite able to wrap themselves in the red dragon flag, as it were, and do well when they look like they're standing up to a pretty iffy Westminster government. Now, clearly, in that case, the SNP can't be dragging their heels and making a lot of this about essentially things like talking about the child poverty
Hmm.
issue, also saying that they would be restoring the winter fuel cuts in Scotland from, I think, this
Yes.
September,
Yep.
and that they would be removing the two-child cap next April.
Yep.
That's definite dates that's saying to Scottish sort of voters, we're so different. These guys can't even row back on a policy that has lost them a whole set of local elections, and we are just moving ahead with what's in us to do. So I think in that respect, all the rest of them can kick and squeal and whatever else you want. But if you put together the Swinney sort of here's the stuff you get that's better for being in Scotland line with the kind of we're just doing this stuff because that's who we are, and this was already in train, and it was right
Hmm.
before all of this. That's probably if you even hear him, to be honest, that's probably what you might take from it. There was also stuff in there because a lot of people have criticised them about not really caring about business enough. So there
Yeah.
was stuff at the end about an export plan, about commercialising good ideas, research, and so on, and about the just transition, a green Grangemouth, and somehow that managed to find its way into the carbon capture Acorn project,
Yes.
which, as everyone will spot, is not at Grangemouth, right? But anyway, might as well chuck them all in and see what sticks.
Yeah.
So it probably it wasn't mind blowing, but if it's all just about presenting over the next year, presenting a different kind of face. So Rachel Reeves is apparently going to continue with these disability cuts. So, okay, seems crazy to me, but that she needs to do this apparently to keep to her fiscal guidelines. Well, good luck, lass, because it looks like that's already so unpopular with the voters and they're going to do more of it. Wales are distancing themselves from it. And Scotland and the SNP are saying we're just going off stage left to kind of just correct all the shite that's coming from London, basically. What are you
Yes.
doing, Annas, really, by the way? So that's
Yes.
probably setting it up for that kind of groove over the next year.
Well, I mean, he was very specific with Anna Sarwar because he hit him with facts and then turned and said, well, just like look at the First Minister of Wales. She's had a vigorous disagreement with the UK Labour government. None of that from Mr. Sarwar. He's right behind the UK government in all, and I thought this was interesting, in its social security policies. Not welfare, social security. And that just sets a different. I mean, maybe I'm reading. Well, no, I'm reading a lot into it from my perspective, not referring to it as welfare, but the traditional way of social security.
But but
And he
this but
ripped
this
into him on that.
But this also matters in a sort of more general way. Now, I know you, Polly Toynbee, there I'm saying it again, that's the second time, and you're going to just go off and spit in the corner, aren't you?
Yes.
Right, so let's just assume that everyone that he did that quietly. Right, nonetheless, here she is today, and okay, you may well go, Polly, that's why we kind of want to get away as an independent country, because you thought you could trust these guys. We could see this a long way off. But anyway, she has nonetheless written a pretty feisty old column that's got an awful lot of detail in it, but is basically pointing out that there's been an analysis of the results. We should get to talking about them
Oh,
specifically
yeah.
in a minute. But anyway, it found that in fact it's switching from the voting in the local election and projecting that onto a general election result. And the analysis by Persuasion UK finds that 123 seats are vulnerable to reform. 250 seats are vulnerable to progressive parties. And you would have to say in that they include the Lib Dems, so you
Yeah.
can decide what you want to do
Yeah.
with that. But basically, Lib Dems and Greens. So what she's saying is you're getting mesmerized by the kind of challenge from reform and trying to sidle up to them and try and look like you're tougher than them. We've heard all the arguments about that it only makes people think, let's just have the real deal instead of this kind of in-betweeny stuff. But her point is that you're losing actually twice as many voters because they're just deciding you're not progressive and they're off. So, you know, there's so many things that are wrong. If you begin to look down at the statistics, so much that's wrong in alienating the sort of old liberal crew. Um, some of it, she's looking at this question of their clampdown on migrants. She's saying that of that group, if you were to look at foreign students within that, most of them return home or they go somewhere else. And this is not, they're a tiny, tiny fraction of the overall migration numbers. But in the Labour city seats, where 750,000 jobs rely on universities, you're going to lose them.
Yeah.
So you go through every sort of different area and think you're just really, on a hiding to nothing. And this kind of, also, if you look at her thing is just no cringing, no trimming. This is the time for outright confrontation with the dark forces of the right. Look at successes in Canada and Australia. We can talk about that. After last week's election disaster, preventing a worst reprise next May needs rapid and highly visible action. And the funny thing about it is, I notice in all the things I'm reading at the moment that the thing that's happening next May is the Senate elections. Nobody
Ah.
mentions Scotland.
No.
It's as if we either aren't, on the radar anymore, or because it's looking like a done deal, nobody's even interested in it. But still, that's a one-time cheerleader for Keir Starmer, who's basically saying this whole thing is now a total disaster.
Yeah, they're either ignoring us, Lesley, or in some commentators that I've listened to in podcasts, who ought to know better, just presume that the reform bandwagon is rolling along very similarly up here, and
Yes, it's infuriating. And I noticed there was another column in the New Statesman that was pointing out at the end of it all that reform is a very polarizing force. I mean, people used to say this, and it was statistically true of Alex Salmond and probably Nicola Sturgeon, but 47% dislike Farage versus 29% who like. So, this author is saying you can still just stay focused on, just lean into what you believe in, and if it's Europe, just can't hesitate. Just get into that and try and repair the damage. The relationship between Nigel Farage and Donald Trump, also a vulnerability on his side, albeit you can just see Keir Starmer, kumbaya, I could really cozy up to Donald Trump given the option, sticking it to Nigel Farage hard enough for that relationship. There's a problem. But somebody else could do it, and that somebody else could easily be John Swinney, except I don't know where he is on the Kumbaya stakes yet for this, visit that may or may not happen this summer. But anyway.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the other thing as well is that, I mean, before we get into the local elections, there was the Runcorn and Helsby by-election, which is over 14,500 Labour majority at the 2024 general election. There was 60% turnout then. There was only a 46% turnout. And of course, that swung, massive swing to Reform. They won by 6 votes after a recount. But the other interesting aspect of that was that Karen Shore, was the candidate, she started a petition in mid-March to close a local hotel used for asylum seekers. So if there's a clear and obvious example, maybe I'm reading, it's the old famous post hoc ergo propter hoc of the fact that she actually switches to Reform's territory and then gets gets beaten by Reform. And we all know by-elections are strange beasts. Yes, you, George Galloway. And it could be a reaction to that. And the 20% drop, well, the 20% of people who didn't vote, who voted at the previous in the general election. And it was a tie, really, just under 40% for Labour and Reform. The Conservatives down to 7%. So in that case, and that seemed to be Reform steaming through, and Kemi Badenoch ought to be very, very worried. But I mean, Reform, we've got to go back to it in the local elections. They won the most votes, the most seats, and overall control of most councils. And the Tories failed to retain control of the 15 councils that they held. Now, what the thing about it is, yes, this is another one, folks. District heating, reform of local government, first past the post system. Let's get wired into that, because on 31% of the vote, they got 41% of the seats.
Yeah,
Labour,
they were
yeah.
they were challenged with that, and I mean they are sort of amusingly nakedly, kind of nifty on this stuff because they'd actually been quite for electoral reform
Hmm.
when they were the rough end of it, but now they think it's not really a priority of the public and kind of, I don't think that's one that we'd be dealing with. But still, it's the stuff that they're kind of,
Oh,
they want to kind of cut anything to do with the climate crisis, anything boosting diversity. And then, of course, as people will have doubtless seen, clamping down on staff working from home, despite the
yeah.
fact that reform is advertising for jobs which are regional organisers. Part of the job description is that you can work for home. Ooh, Mrs. But also drawing up plans for the mass deportation of illegal immigrants should they get in, to Westminster. I don't
Yeah.
think even they think they can do that from county councils, but they're trying to start legal action. This is all just kind of Doge minor and Trump copycat to try to stop asylum seekers from being settled within county councils that they control. And then there's another one, which is the chair of reform is announcing that only the Union Jack, the St George's Cross, can fly at English councils now that they
Yeah.
control. So essentially, that means not the Ukraine flag.
Mm. Or
So
anybody
yeah,
else's.
yeah,
Because yeah, but I just wonder if they fly the Israeli flag. I just thought I'd throw that one in there. That might get an exemption.
yeah, yes.
Mm.
That sounds like, well, yeah.
Mm.
We'll come back to that in a
Yes.
minute. But I see that the other thing that in the midst of all this, though, and I wish I'd looked at it more carefully, was that the one of the clever moves that Farage made was to begin to sound kind of old left wing.
Yeah.
Now, I wish I'd looked at enough of what the examples of that were, but they're
Well, he was
apparently.
talking. Oh, sorry, Leslie.
No,
I
on you
was.
go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, apparently, he was talking about with the public utilities and water. What they were talking
Yes.
about with 50% stake taken by the state, and then 50% owned by communities or something like that. I mean, there was a 50% stake by the state, and it's just trying to reflect on that, and 50% by local companies, but not it was to take it out with the control of these big non-UK based multinationals.
Well, there's a piece, it was in the FT talking about, again, looking at the next elections, which again only seem to be Wales, but that reform will try to appeal to Wales' industrial heartlands. So again, it's kind of taking the shape of whatever looks like, it'll win. And one quote comes from a senior figure from the Communication Workers Union who said, the choice really is between Labour and reform in most workplaces. And this is trade unionists.
Hmm.
And he or she is saying that Farage's call to let Thames Water collapse was a breath of fresh air. So if they sort of start to pony in a little bit harder on this, and it leaves everybody else looking at like shades of grey, and that's going to be a problem. That could be a problem within Scotland as well.
Yeah, because we spoke about this, I think it was about 6, 7 weeks ago when we were actually saying the fact that if Farage was smart, he would veer left on the economy while tacking right on immigration and social issues. You know,
Which he could do.
nationalisation. Let's take a look at, well, he was supporting nationalisation of Scunthorpe. And he was
He could,
calling for it.
he could just sit with that. I mean, because
Yeah.
that's so popular across the whole UK. 70% support for that, and everybody else too. It's too complicated. Or it's going to take too much time. It's going to take too much public money, or they don't want to end up. The lawyers are advising them that it's too tough to do. Whereas, of course, these guys are not worrying about detail like that. The other thing I heard in the midst of, in the mix was it the Tories who were basically saying, trying to suggest that reform in Scotland were basically pro-independence.
Yes.
I thought, oh God, I missed that one, really. But I
Yeah.
mean, it would be quite something
Well,
if they.
Russell Finley's grasping at straws, to be perfectly frank, because you can see the line that he's taking. He's going to go to the right, to the right, to the right, and try and retain that core of pro-unionist voters up here who are anti-gender reform, who are anti-immigration, and he's fighting on that ground in order to maintain the Tory lead within that voter cohort. Because what you've actually got at the Holyrood elections, well, if Reform actually does as well as it's been suggested, 17% I think in constituency, 16% on the list votes. I mean, they will be fighting. There will be two fronts on which the right up here, the pro-union right, will be fighting, and it will be Reform versus the Conservatives. So it'll be they can stand to lose out, but Labour shouldn't be too relaxed about it as well, because I mean, when John Curtis did the analysis, I mean, it did say that Reform, well, believe it or not, I mean, you're going to be stunned by this, very popular with 2016 vote leavers and 2019ers who voted for Boris Johnson. So that was a big one there.
Yeah,
And they
wouldn't it be the biggest constituency in Scotland? I would have thought that, but
No, I
still.
mean, I had a wee look at the figures on that, and the only place that actually came got the only council that came reasonably close was a couple of hundred votes was Murray, but
Right.
everything else it was substantial majorities for Remain.
But to stand back from this a minute, because you can dive into the statistics. This is one hell of a thing that happened.
Yes,
And I mean, everybody, you will have watched all everybody saying there's the end of the two-party system. You kind of go, we haven't had a two-party system here for quite a long time
hmm
in Scotland and probably Wales. But anyway, nonetheless, at UK level, this is, massively significant. And there was a More in Common poll that it actually did a review of the local results that was published this morning. And there's new polling from them that suggests 1 in 3 British voters think Farage will be Prime Minister after the next election.
yeah,
So the thing is, that is quite a game changer. It's got to be a game changer, and it's got to be a game changer on the independence front, because we've now reached, I mean, we've gone through all the stuff that I can't remember who did an excellent column that just listed all the things you would have thought were unbelievable. Boris Johnson getting elected,
yeah,
Boris Johnson proroguing Parliament, Brexit, leaving the European Union, all the crazy stuff that's happened, the Partygate, the kind of offence caused, the fast lane, the VIP lane in COVID, yada, yada, yada. But we're now sitting here saying that, there's a serious chance Nigel Farage will be Prime Minister. Right. What are we doing then? There's got to be some response to this, because that's got to be the best calling card ever
yeah.
for beginning to get people focused back on the idea that we now need to get some kind of mandate clear to be able to move forward. And, everybody else can come in with their, but what about this? What about that? How's the mandate going to work? The point is that whatever, it's got to have that possibility or probability actually in our sights from here on in.
Yeah, I mean, because I mean that is the. I mean, I'm with you. I remember was it Blair McDougall when he was on was in 2014 when there was a debate program talking laughing off the potential of Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister, laughing off the potential of leaving the European Union. No, 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 no. Well, I mean, you'll not be laughing now, Blair. I mean, because the Farage mirage, the Farage nightmare is on the horizon. And I'm with you entirely. I think that ought to be the focus of the campaign for Holyrood. The focus of the campaign for Holyrood, which then feeds into the development of that argument of why we've got to get out this rotten union. And the
But it
other,
won't be, will it?
no, I mean, yeah,
I mean,
but
there's stories running at the moment, and it's hard to know because it's so wrapped up in individual personalities and so on about candidates.
yes,
Um, and
yeah,
this is probably a little premature because we ain't got definite results in any of them.
no,
And there's many ways you could interpret some of the individuals' fates who are at the
hmm
heart of all of this. But there are suggestions in at least one seat, Falkirk West, there's been a candidate sort of taken off the ballot who
yeah.
recently said independence had been just, erased from the campaign and that this was, a seriously bad thing. Now, as I say, there's a lot of caveats in that because we don't know what else is going on. That's literally just happened before we came on air.
hmm
But there's definitely a couple of candidates who, you would be looking out for to see whether they make it into being selected for the constituencies or not.
Yeah, well, because I mean, the name that sprang immediately to mind we were talking about, it's not going to be independence, it's not going to be at the forefront, well, will it be at the forefront, was Ben McPherson, because he was the that was the infant, people might not remember, I think it was 2023, the infamous interview he did in the Financial Times, talking about the fact there should be a gradualist approach, and we've got to take it to Carney, and what we've got to do is prior to a more evolutionary pivot to a more evolutionary process of delivering further constitutional change, working with others to build consensus and move forward. I get you put that on the bar, and I'll get right behind that. You know, I
Hmm.
mean, that's going to get folk out on the street. And of course, he resigned his ministerial role in March 2023 because he wouldn't serve in the Humza Yousaf government, and he's been challenged by Kelly Parry. And I took a look at her. I mean, and what I did was the three major contests. It's Ben McPherson, Kelly Parry, Colin Beattie, and Adam Knowles McVeigh, and Colette Stevenson and Caroline Belch were the three contests, if you like, where there were challenges that's sitting in pretty well-known MSPs. And what I did is I took a look at the candidate statements as much as I could. How do we look at their Twitter feeds as well? Kelly Parry, again, what she's the leader of Midlothian Council. She's been that since 2022. Interestingly, she came into politics because of the independence referendum in 2014. So she came in through that mean independence first, and then got into the SNP as a political party. And she said her most significant earliest memory is attending a Durham miners rally. She spent some time in care, but her Twitter feed was just pretty standard stuff, and I couldn't find her candidate statement. Whereas Adam Knowles McVeigh, the Leith councillor, everything he does on Twitter is related, and he puts Scottish independence first. Scottish independence, Scottish independence. That's tacked onto everything he talks about in terms of the way that the UK government is currently behaving, and he attaches that to that. Similarly with Caroline Belch, I had a look at her candidate statement, and she said she was campaigning for independence before joining the party. She's a trusted local voice, she claims, leading ready for the campaign for independence in East Kilbride. I want to repeat to you and our constituency, I want to represent your constituency, but most of all, I want Scotland to be free. Colette Stevenson, yes, there's only one choice for Scotland and its people, that's independence, and it's fairly standard stuff in terms of that of the SNP material it's putting out, relating about the failures of the UK government. And Colin Beattie, similarly, the fairly standard stuff from Colin in terms of that. Lots of mentions of local, I think, with Collins. But I mean, it'll be interesting to see what happens. And again, I'm just putting that out there. I do not know these people. And I'm just going by their public statements and the Twitter feeds and their candidate statements to come to sort of a valuation as to whether they were alternative, if you know what I mean, candidates in forcing the independence issue, as opposed to gradualism, the gradualism.
Yeah, well, we'll see. We'll see where it goes because the candidates list, I think, for the SNP is due to be published today or tomorrow. So,
Yeah,
people who know the runners and riders can kind of, draw things from it.
yeah,
Meanwhile, though, there's a lot been going on obviously on the international front, and
yes,
just to put it blooming mildly, I
yeah,
mean, this might not seem the most important thing, but the German situation's been interesting. And again, I mean, we could talk about Canada, we could talk about Australia, but even though the Australians are part of Eurovision, we're in the continent of Europe. And it's weird that everybody gets more interested in Canada and Australia than they do about actually one of the biggest countries in Europe. And there was a weird thing that happened today. I see that in the last hour it has just been corrected, but the new incoming Conservative Chancellor, elect Merz, Friedrich Merz, didn't win the vote to make him the next Chancellor.
hmm
And this was kind of like a weird one because he needed 316 votes. He got 310. And it was the first time in Germany's post war history that a candidate had lost the first round of voting because they only put people forward who are going to win.
right.
So this was kind of described as a complete catastrophe, a punch to the stomach. It was, and some of this is interesting as well because Merz was the one who was coming out with the let's just take the fiscal rules and chuck them over our shoulders and let's put mega bucks into improving the public domain. And there was a stage where we were going, this sounds all right, actually. These guys are really going to invest in the public realm, basically. But that hacked off a lot of traditional conservatives who went, see, that's not us. That's them over there. That's the, CDU, that's the Social Democrats, rather. So that kind of muddied the water a bit for him. But interestingly, a lot of commentators think that the difficulty for him was the endorsement given to the far right Alternative for Deutschland, AfD party, by Donald Trump. And it's interesting that because I should say that there's been a second round of voting already today, and those who nobody knows quite who failed to vote what way because he should have been home and dry. So there was a lot of kicking ankles and stuff like that beneath the table. And suddenly he's now got 325 votes. So, the job's a good one. But it's another little flash of how this, the Trumpian stuff is working differently in different
Yeah.
countries. Because in Romania also, in fact, the Romanian prime minister, who's a bit of a lefty social democrat, has just resigned because a right-wing candidate won the first round of the presidential election. So there's it that way in
hmm
Europe. And then meanwhile, obviously, people know Mark Carney won, hyper big time. Well, big time enough. It was a big time improvement on where everyone thought that Mark Carney and the Liberal Party would be. But, so he won in Canada with a very sort of confrontational. In fact, the Hugh Grant speech, from Love Actually, Mark Carney almost did it. Just looked down the camera and just, said, "It's going to stay Canadian. You'll never have it. We'll take you on." And so it was perceived that that really gave a big helping hand, the Trump challenge directly, and this actually the choice of his opposition in embracing Trump language, so that part of the campaigning slogan in Canada for the Conservative, who was everyone thought would win, was making Canada great again. That might have
Yeah.
looked a good idea before everything happened that happened. And then suddenly on the back of that, in Australia,
Yes.
Labour's Anthony Albanese won when everyone was certain he was going to lose. And
Yeah.
his opponent there, Peter Dutton, the Tory, had promised a sort of government efficiency department, a kind of Doge, Elon Musk type thing. But there was kind of other things. Interestingly, one of the other issues down the sheet a little bit was that I didn't realise this. There's a ban on nuclear power in Australia, as
Oh.
there is essentially in Scotland through our planning powers. And the Conservative opponent, Peter Dutton, had come in saying that he was going to end this ban on nuclear power, essentially saying, let's get back into nuclear power. And that polled really badly. So, if you look across the world, before everybody starts getting completely, you know, sort of despondent and like it's just gloomy and there's only one way this is all going, it's interesting how much genuine politics and stuff is going on, all prompted to some degree by Donald Trump and the right or wrong moves in their own context that each political system is making in trying to either oppose or emulate him.
Yeah, I thought Albanese's statements at the end of it, he said it was a victory for fairness, aspiration, and opportunity for all, and the strength to show courage in adversity and kindness to those in need, because it was a Trumpian campaign that Dutton ran on immigration, public sector cuts, and anti-China. And what he what Albanese has said is going to make healthcare more affordable, housing more affordable, and do more to address climate change and protect the environment and advance reconciliation for First Nations people. But I thought it was interesting because he's doing more to address climate change when we seem to have had, if Keir Starmer thought his enemies in Reform were out to get him, what about his mates? What about
Yes.
Tony Blair? With friends like that, who needs enemies?
Well, this is what I wrote last week's national column about. I'd started off meaning it to be just about Canada, and then thought, blimmin' heck, what a day for Keir Starmer because it was all happening, and this is before the local election results. But Tony Blinken Blair, you can't stop the boy, and he's popped up again. I mean, to be fair, it's possibly just pops up places, and now that he's started the ball rolling, he can speak in some obscure college somewhere in the Midwest, no doubt coining in quite a lot of money,
Mm,
but just gets covered in a way that, it's a journalistic choice to cover this guy. But still, I mean, he had actually produced a forward to a report by his own think tank where he was saying that people in rich countries no longer want to make financial sacrifices when their impact on global emissions is minimal.
mm.
And I mean, this one, again, this is one that people really need to take on and argue about and not just kind of try and just brush over this a bit. Because, I mean, as I was trying to say in this, I know everyone's going, oh God, not Denmark again. But the countries that have figured this out already, it wouldn't make a difference. I mean, the Danish decision was nothing about the planet. It was it was all about energy security. And it wouldn't matter to that, essentially, if the rest of the planet kept guzzling gas and just did all the bad stuff, because what Denmark has done is reduced its dependency on fossil fuels, but on other countries and their behaviors, has been a pioneer in a new renewable field so that something like a fifth of all the turbines in the world are Vestas wind turbines. That should have been us. All of that stuff happens when you've got the courage to make a political decision early doors and you aren't kind of going, no, but it's no point because China's still pumping out whatever. No, you're getting your house in order and it's worth it whether China kept pumping out crap or not. But meanwhile, back at the fort, just on the same day, there was a very interesting report from Nicholas Stern, who is now Lord Nicholas Stern. I just should say that nobody in this column wasn't a Lord or a Sir somebody. It's Sir Keir Starmer, Sir Tony Blair, Lord Nicholas Stern, honest to actual God. Can normal people never just run something ever in Westminster politics? I'm slightly getting my gas at a peep here because I'm speaking at a Republic event on Saturday, which is an anti-monarchy event in Edinburgh. So yeah, this is how all this pernicious stuff gets in, the ranking of
Hmm.
people this way. Anyway, Nicholas Stern was just pointing out that China now has more wind and solar than fossil fuel power. So, it's not perfect, but, Bloomberg, who are the real financial experts, say that global demand for coal has peaked and will decline 25% over the rest of this decade. You can go through all these things. Reuters, global sales of electric and plug-in hybrids up 30% on last year. And that one that I really liked, well, two. One is Zambia, because everyone worries about the coming economies and how they'll deal with things. But Zambia has reduced the approval time for solar applications from 6 months to 48 hours. Now, that's a bit of dodging that's kind of,
Yeah.
on the right side. And finally, American solar energy will reach basically 182 gigawatts next year. But the point is, the solar energy in the States next year will be double the levels in 2023, despite Trump. So, I mean, of course, it's not enough, but it's not nothing. And the way that Tony Blair was speaking was as if, we're the great. It's another piece of really English exceptionalism that we're the only people who are trying hard on stuff. And, there's no point in us trying because out there it's a wilderness. They're all greedy. They're all,
Yeah.
going backwards. They're all using coal. And if you bother to look at a lot of the change that's happening, it's not home and dry. I'm sure a lot of Green campaigners would say it's not enough. It's not enough, but it's not where Tony Blair is painting it, and that's important.
Yeah. I mean, but that's the thing of me, because do you think that Blair was attempting to edge once again into that reform territory? I mean, which is climate change is a hoax. We're going to We're going to drill more. We're going to get more gas out. We're going to get more oil out. Uh, we're going to frack. We're going to do all these things. And we're going, I tell you what, we're also going to do. It's because these low emission zones and everything like that, that's playing into that right wing populist perspective that's been promulgated by Farage. And you just, it might have something to do with possibly where Tony Blair gets his money from. I don't know. But it just seems really, really odd. As you say, it's English exceptionalism, despite his having gone to Fetties. Or maybe because he went to Fetties. I don't know.
Sorry, there was a little cough there in case you thought I was
Oh,
unusually reacting.
yes, I thought, oh God, I've silenced Lesley Riddick, which many a unionist and people on the right have attempted to do over years.
But then, actually, funnily enough, I noticed that there's dear old David Attenborough, who's
Yeah,
99.
God, yeah,
So he's entering his 100th year, and this gives him, he gets a platform to say stuff for being him. Um, but he has basically said, after almost 100 years on this planet, I now understand the most important place on Earth is at sea. And that's really important because, the marine environment and everything that he's trying to say about that, he's giving that really big priority, big licks, prominence. And I hope there will be as much unraveling of that message that he's trying to make over the coming week as there is to the slightly fatuous, not researched at all
mm,
rubbish that Tony Blair came out with.
right. Yeah, just we thought that things couldn't get more depressing having talked about Tony Blair. I see that the Israeli Security Cabinet say they're going to capture the entire Gaza Strip, remain for an unspecified amount of time. It's going to be a forceful operation to destroy Hamas and rescue hostages, and 2.1 million Palestinians are going to be moved to protect them. They're going to allow aid to enter, but through private companies. So they're going to be cutting out the United Nations and other humanitarian organizations. They're going to allow aid to enter. And the food plan that they've got, it's US companies, one food parcel per week in designated hubs in southern Gaza, 60 trucks per day, which are 1/10 of what's needed. And they say it's going to be put more pressure, say the aid agencies, on the Gazans, and the UN and other aid agencies have turned around and said this is against basic humanitarian principles, won't cooperate. Starmer, of course, has said he's got deep concern about this, and Smotrich, at a conference, that's an Israeli finance minister at the conference in the illegal settlement of Afar said Gaza will soon be completely destroyed. And this is chilling. Population will be concentrated into a corridor in the south and then leave in large numbers to third countries, following on from the Trump plan. And it's, I hesitate to get very personal on this, but I'm going to. I saw a photograph, and it's easy to scroll through things, and I made myself look at it. It was a photograph on Twitter of a 4-month-old baby that had died of starvation in Gaza. And our Juno's 4 months old, my granddaughter, and it destroys one to actually see what's going on. And I'm going to say, at what fucking time will people get off their arses and actually do something about this? It took Ursula von der Leyen no time at all to turn and say the EU was going to cooperate and work together to stop these wildfires that were raging through Israel. Well, get off your bloody arse, and what you're going to do to actually break the embargo and break the stoppage on aid getting into Gaza, Ursula. What are you going to do about it, Keir Starmer?
Yeah.
Enough's enough. Bairns are dying, people are dying, and you're cooperating with it and you're encouraging it. And it's just enough's a fucking enough. Isolate them. Boycott, divest, isolate these people. We do not want to have anything to do with them. Stop the arms sales, and let's get some balls together in the international community to actually force aid in and not be dependent on the people of the Freedom Flotilla who go in there to actually try and get aid into Gaza, who are then attacked by Israeli drones to stop them getting in. Enough's enough.
Totally, totally. And I mean, as well as this, I don't know how anybody can now come out with lines about we're very concerned. Does anyone hear themselves? You know, we've gone, the language is just been used up, eaten up by what's happened. But the UN is also very concerned.
Mm.
And I mean, okay, you could give up on Britain ever taking any sort of real leadership stance on this. But what's the United Nations for now if there
Yeah.
isn't some mechanism within it? Because there is no point. And I'd imagine, of course, they've got America sitting in there who'll just veto whatever they do. But then, okay, let them veto it. Then
Yeah.
let everybody decide what they want to do as a result of that, because you've got a broken vessel sitting there at the moment, which cannot do anything for the duration of Trump's presidency that is even, reasonably centrist for the rest of the world. Because for him, his politics are so skewed and support for Israel so strong that we're going to be sitting this for another 4 years. So, either people are going to be eaten up and international institutions essentially hollowed out if they don't make a stand and somebody try to figure out how they can get a stance out of this. I mean, the last time we were around this, the South Africans were
Yeah.
brave enough to take some actions in the international court and then got blooming boycotted and all sorts of collars felt by the Americans and the Israelis. I mean, yeah, I'm totally with you. I mean, I was even sitting this morning thinking about what would happen if we had a mass hunger strike of people sitting outside Holyrood or Westminster. And then you think, you just, in my lifetime, I've seen that happen,
Yeah.
with no avail, actually, in the case of the hunger strikers in Ireland. But, like, what more can we do? I guess we could have incredibly large um, rallies and marches. There were some
Hmm.
candidates within the local elections, but obviously this absolute bombshell hadn't happened in time for the support to grow in the English local elections there. But there's got to be some response to this. It's like everybody's just, it happened, it was said casually, and you just think, we can't let this go ahead. We've got to see some sort of political response to it. And yet, I don't know. I mean, we'll see what happens in Prime Minister's questions. Much as that's going, the whole world's going to bloom and wait for that. But I really hope the SNP, if they even get called, and they don't these
Yes.
days, that's the problem as well. You could have relied on Stephen Flynn to have put a really pointed question forward, but now he doesn't even get called most of the time. So we've no mechanism to express utter disgust
Yeah.
and
Um,
horror. Actually,
yeah,
it's
it's
horror
horror.
is where we are now.
I mean, and the question is always asked. I used to think to myself, what I would have done in the 1930s, when fascism was on the rise in Britain and fascism was on the rise and in right across Europe. And if people are wondering what they would have done then, what are you doing now? Because this is the great moral war of our time. Where do you stand on this? Where do you stand on this? And again, we keep coming back to it. These are real people, real children dying as we speak. And it is just my government, the UK government, is complicit in this and all sorts of levels that are going to come out as well. But
And
I mean,
the situation there, I notice as well that Hamas
yeah,
says it's executed 6 Palestinians in Gaza
yeah,
and shot 13 others in the legs. This is so redolent of Northern Ireland
yeah,
for alleged looting, and suggesting that actually these armed gangs are wandering the streets of Gaza City, going after the remaining food supplies, and Hamas claims that they're collaborating with Israel. I mean, who knows now
yeah,
what's going on there? But this is where it all begins to fall apart. And the guy, I wish I could remember his name, the excellent guy from the Norwegian Refugee Council was on Channel 4 News. I mean, the only person I've seen just barely contained rage from the man who spent his entire life in this stuff and saying, the trouble is with the proposals that the Israelis have, where they're going to be the ones that will administer aid.
hmm,
And he was saying their proposals are probably that one person from a family can come, and only if they have got face recognition will they get food. So then they can be absolutely policed and patrolled so that if their face crops up anywhere, demonstration, anything else, that's it, no more food. And his organization is saying, there's no way we can be involved with that because our whole thing about humanitarian distribution of aid is that it goes where it's needed to whomever it
Yes.
needs it. And you don't have to perform tricks to get it. But the horror of that then is that these guys who might have been slight mediating forces in all of this, and of course, these guys won't feel safe because they've
Oh,
already
yeah.
killed 15 distributors of aid. But these mitigating forces won't even be present in this future scenario. This is just leaving the people of Gaza alone.
Yeah. And as I said, the Israeli government said they want to create a sterile area. And when I was looking at this, Lesley, what I did is I decided to go through all the BBC output on this. And and people can check this up for themselves. On every single article that I read about Gaza, there's an obligatory BBC paragraph, two paragraphs at the end, one of which talks about the October the 7th attack, followed by the Palestinian death toll with, according to the territory's Hamas-run health ministry. And that's on every, so it's there. It must just be copied and pasted by the BBC into every single story about Gaza. That
Which
has to be
actually,
in
when
there.
I've heard decent correspondents, they will feel the need to say that and will then say, and in the past, their assessments have been absolutely accurate.
Yeah.
So attributing it is one thing, but then using your knowledge as a
Hmm.
correspondent to
That's
come in
different.
and say what do you make of that? Obviously, it comes from a certain source, but clearly the Israelis have lied in their, so something that comes from the Israeli, Defense Force. Right, there's the guys who lied the last time, and that needs to be called out. So you can judge what you think of that source. The Hamas ministry has tended to be fairly accurate,
Hmm.
and most commentators would say that. But like where it leaves everybody, because I don't know if we're sitting in the middle of Victory for Europe
Oh, yeah.
week, and it's very bittersweet then to see, well, to see everything really, to see the last of the old
Yeah.
soldiers basically being paraded, to see the Ukrainians in there, hoping to still. And the trouble is, there's only so much time we spend on these, but we constantly are focused on Israel, Gaza because
Hmm.
of, well, just the
Yeah.
disgustingness of it. But Ukraine is still sitting, completely in the brink. But I noticed that there was, again, looking again at polls again, but 55% of respondents in 5 European countries, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, 55% say they think another world war is likely within the next 5 to 10 years.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. I mean, they're not quite sure. Even the Americans think 45% of them think that. And and quite a number, many Europeans, and you can go through the different countries, but they're all Spain, Germany, France, all over 50%, see tensions with the United States as a major to moderate threat to continental peace. They're not saying necessarily going to end up going to war with America, but just the level of
Yeah.
destabilization leaves everybody. I mean, I was half watching. Gosh, I'm not even going to get this right. The Dark Knight
Oh,
film
yeah.
that's been
Batman.
on. I mean, I didn't see it the first time round, and sort of it's like about 4 hours long. I mean, honestly, but and anything that's got dystopian on it, I just think, no, not for me, mate. But I did sort of watch it, and then if you watch it too late at night, it just goes into your mind, into your nightmares, and it just feels so similar to where things are at the moment. Just thuggery, brute force, relentlessness, greed, violence, endless fighting. I appreciate that's not where we are at the moment with with America. But I mean, it's unbelievable if you look at some of the press that there is about Canada. There's many of the Canadians are now basically facing the possibility that they will be at war with America. I just read an article by sort of seriously qualified people who are saying, it would be difficult for the Americans to basically take the cities of Canada. But one of them says, let's just say they hold the oil fields.
Good
It's just
grief.
this, I mean, it's
It's just,
extraordinary. And then, someone is quoted as saying, nobody is born an insurgent because everyone's saying that the Canadians are so cool and kind of, sweet and everything. And this guy is saying, nobody's born an insurgent. Insurgency is what happens when someone kills your mum. And they're seriously, they're pointing out that more than a quarter of Canadian households own a gun. If only 1 in 100 Canadians took up arms against an American occupation, the force would be 10 times the size of the Taliban. I mean,
This is,
it's like,
it's,
where the hell are we going with this?
but the only thing I can grasp about this, and it's is the fact that in the 1930s and the 1940s, the forces of good did triumph, eventually, and a different world order was born. I mean, and I take a look at, I mean, Smerts and Carney aren't exactly left wing. Let's
No,
be honest about that. I
no.
mean, if we're turning around saying, thank goodness, a conservative and a liberal, let's put a liberal capitalist won, that's good news, and at least in Australia, it was a social democratic victory. There are victories to be won. And the thing about it as well, we can concentrate on our, well, thinking globally, I concentrate on our own wee corner of the world, and what we can do here, what we can do locally, what we can do nationally in order to further the advance of a fairer, wealthier, happier
But
Scotland.
sure, but I still think, we need to be in that, back to old Winnie Ewing's phrase, stop the world, Scotland wants to
Yeah.
get on. When we're an independent country, we need to have an awareness of
Yeah.
where we are,
Hmm.
geopolitically, if you like. And the thinking behind these folk that are, well, here's one possible scenario, which is that Trump has sort of signaled, well, the administration wants a third term. He's suggesting that, oh, it wouldn't be him.
Hmm.
But then there's been suggestions that Vance might stand as the presidential candidate and then give way to Trump comes back.
Hmm.
Actually, a lot of people saying don't think Vance is that kind of, don't think he probably would. But still, this is like the thought of another 4 or 5 years of these guys in addition to what there is. Now, what these writers are suggesting is that if Trump does decide to run again, or Vance, a manufactured emergency over Canada would be a convenient excuse for overturning all constitutional barriers.
Jeez.
I mean, I'll put the link into it, but the very powerful ending is a quote from John F. Kennedy, who said of the Canadians, geography made us neighbours, history made us friends, economics made us partners, necessity has made us allies. Well, you
Mm.
know, not I mean, still, I think people are saying the end of America would destroy Canada and vice versa, But the fact that you could even be sitting, even semi seriously thinking about this is just testimony to the appalling state of things at the moment that needs people to call a blimmin' spade
Yeah.
and have a bit more Mark Carney, a bit more Anthony Albanese, a bit more Smedham.
Yeah. Well, I mean, well, the bit of breaking news that just come through, though, that the US will stop bombing the Houthis effective immediately, says Trump. So that just come through on my feed from Al Jazeera there. And I mean, it was, it's a funny kind of thing because I went to the Flaming Lips gig at the Usher Hall, which lifted my spirits no end on Thursday. It was absolutely fabulous. It was ludicrous. It was noisy. It was colourful. It was absolutely bonkers in a beautiful kind of way. And they have a song called In All Your Power, which is actually a protest song about the state of the world and everything like that. So it's a brilliant song, but it did lift my spirits. And Wayne Coyne talks constantly about love when he's during the gig. So I recommend anybody that's got any chance actually, and this is really bizarre. The album Yoshimi versus the Pink Robots is actually an allegory about fighting cancer. And it's got some of the most uplifting songs in the world on it. So there you go, a cheery album about fighting cancer. And it was brilliant. It was absolutely nuts in psychedelic, crazy kind of way. And at one point, it was like, and he says, now, I don't want to embarrass you, but if you come with family or friends, turn around and give them a hug. He says,
Mhm.
now I'm going to ask you to turn around and give someone you don't know a hug. And everybody in the Usher Hall did it. We turned around and hugged the stranger. So you mean there are glimmers of light within the darkness, and it's these things we've got to cling on to while still fighting for
Yeah.
a future.
Actually, you're reminding me then that there is also, if you're around Dundee,
Hmm.
there's, I believe, in Scotland, kind of cultural day. I'm part of it on Sunday in Dundee, so it should be good, very good crack. And it's kind of they've done this in Glasgow and Perth before, and it's not lots of people standing lecturing you from the stage, although it looks like I will. But no, I'll be in conversation with Alistair Heather just about how the Nordic countries do things differently. But the vast majority of it is singing, performing, and just good crack. So we'll put the link up to that, and if you're
Yeah.
around Dundee, please come.
Yes, and I hope Ali is in good form after the Dundee United St Mirren game on Saturday, because he, like me, is a fervent Arab. And I did get my reference to football in at the last minute.
So can I though slot in just a little hello to someone? I know we don't do this very often, but Andrew Wilson, who so kindly put me up in Canusi when I was showing the film there, is in hospital now in Raigmore. So, Andra, get yourself together, and I hope you're very well soon and back to fighting fit.
Yes, and if I can slot in as well, thanks to all our subscribers. I mean, we wouldn't be able to do this without you folks. So the pals and the buddies, we don't say it often enough, I don't think. I mean, it's probably because I feel quite embarrassed about actually saying thank you as an East Coast Scot. But thank you very much to all our subscribers. And on that note, we'll see you next week, chums.